What if disease wasn't a malfunction, but a harmonic disturbance? What if every cell in your body, every leaf, every root wasn't just alive, but vibrating? That was the strange idea of a Russian-born engineer named Georges Lakhovsky. Sound mad? Hospitals didn't think so. They gave him patients, and he gave them results. The establishment called him eccentric, many called him dangerous, but his ideas didn't die, they simply went underground. This isn't just about healing, it's about rediscovering what vitality truly is, and how you can awaken it in soil, seeds, and cells alike. Welcome to the world of Georges Lakhovsky, where energy isn't just power, it's the secret of life. Hi there, Rayleigh Bacon here, and welcome to the Electriculture Foundation series, where we explore the unseen forces behind plant growth, magnetism, light, atmospheric charge, the hidden harmonics of our living Earth, and of course, the untold stories, the rebels, the researchers, the mystics, and the forgotten science. Coming up in Season 2, Episode 4, we've got the confused carrier pigeons zapped by EMF disturbances, the handmade copper circuits vibrating their way to plant harmony, and the resonant technology of the 1920s that spawned the New Age movements we know today. Oh, it's all love and light. This is Georges Lakhovsky's Untold Secret of Life. Oh, finally, we're about to talk about something new. No more spiral antennas for a few weeks at least. Thank God. Oh, man. You know, it's kind of wild how sometimes the most interesting stuff, like the truly ahead of its time ideas, they just sort of disappear, you know? Like they were way too early, or maybe too weird, or maybe too effective. Do you think maybe they're just too effective? That could be it. Yeah, probably too effective. Okay, now I got my audio levels up. It's so hot here. Oh, the heat wave in Europe is killing me. Oh, dear. Georges Lakhovsky, he was one of those names, you know? In the 1920s and 30s, his work was a big deal, apparently. You had doctors in France, even the US, using this thing that he called the Multi-Wave Oscillator. MWO for short. Sounds way too close to NWO, New World Order kind of stuff. Maybe it needs to be rebranded. Anyway, incredible reports. I mean, I've been digging through lots of old books on the guy. He's written a lot. A bit painful, really. He was apparently able to cure degenerative diseases, like reports of cancer resolved in 3 to 5 sessions, 20 minutes each. That's it. Don't quote me on that. I'll end up like Reich in a prison. Ugh. Withering away in a pile of my own orgone energy. Anyway, I hope that's not the way my life finishes. But then World War II hit, and afterwards, like all good things, it just disappeared. But hey, that's why you're here, right? We're bringing this stuff back. Yeah, bringing this stuff back. Where'd the audio go? Paris, 1925. A city alive with invention and upheaval. The streets hummed with the rattle of automobiles, their engines coughing against the crisp morning air. Overhead, streetlights flickered uncertainly, their glow competing with the neon buzz of new electric signs. Radios crackled in cafes, their transmissions threading through the din of conversation as voices from distant cities leapt through the ether. The world was transforming faster than ever before, but not all discoveries announced themselves with fanfare. Beyond the grandeur of the boulevards, past the cafes filled with artists and intellectuals, there existed another Paris, one of quiet rooms where ideas took shape before the world was ready to hear them. Inside a modest laboratory, tucked away from the bustling streets, a lone scientist stood at the threshold of something extraordinary. Georges Lakhovsky leaned over a row of geraniums, his sharp eyes studying them beneath the glow of a flickering gas lamp. The air in the small laboratory was thick with the scent of damp soil and oxidized copper. Outside, the city marched toward modernity, blind to the invisible forces he sought to unveil. But what he saw before him defied logic. Lakovsky had done something unthinkable. Days earlier, he had deliberately introduced a pathogen into these plants, a cruel but necessary step in his research. The disease had begun its grim work. Leaves began to yellow, stems became weakened, life slowly slipped away. Yet amid the withering plants, something peculiar stood out. Some remained untouched by the affliction. Their stems stayed strong, their leaves vibrant and green. There was only one difference: a single copper coil. A simple, unassuming loop of metal rested around the base of these thriving plants. No electricity, no external power, just the coil. Lakovsky watched, transfixed. The diseased plants without coils wilted in their pots. They slowly began to die. But their coiled counterparts resisted, standing defiantly against the sickness. It was no accident. The coils were acting as conduits, interacting with something unseen, something fundamental. Could it be that life itself was held together by an invisible web of oscillations? Lakovsky removed his glasses, his hands trembling slightly as he exhaled. If his theory was correct, if these passive coils were somehow reinforcing the plant's vitality, then he had stumbled upon something that could change the very foundations of medicine. His mind raced. If these coils could protect plants, could they do the same for animals, for humans? Could disease, perhaps even aging itself, be a consequence of disrupted frequencies? And more importantly, could it be reversed? Outside, Paris hummed with the ceaseless march of progress. Inside this dimly lit laboratory, a discovery that might alter the course of history was unfolding in silence. For centuries, Western medicine had viewed the body as a machine, a system of pumps, gears, and cogs, with illness framed as mechanical failure. A heart attack, a clogged valve, infection, a foreign invader breaching the walls of the fortress. Disease in this model was something to be cut out, poisoned, burned, or overpowered. But Lakovsky saw something different. To him, life was not mechanical, it was vibrational. Everything in the universe oscillated, from the delicate hum of a violin string to the great sweeping orbits of planets. Sound was vibration. Light was vibration. Even the invisible forces that shaped existence, electricity, magnetism, radio waves, they were nothing more than oscillations moving through space, the ether. Why should life be any different? Lakovsky believed that every living cell was not just a biological unit, but a tiny resonator, a microscopic antenna continuously emitting and absorbing electromagnetic frequencies. The healthier the cell, the stronger and more stable its frequency. But when this resonance was disrupted by disease, environmental toxins, or stress, the cell began to lose its vitality, falling out of harmony with the greater symphony of life. If disease was a loss of resonance, he wondered, could healing be as simple as restoring the lost frequency? I first came across Georges Lakhovsky in his book, The Secret of Life. I do recommend it. He does have a lot of books, and there's actually another book that, for insiders, I'll stick in the bottom. It's written by Thompson Brown, and he compiled different concepts from Lakhovsky and others. It's pretty intense, but there are some summaries in there that made this a lot more easy to comprehend. Most people think Georges Lakhovsky was the originator of the oscillating circuit, that device that he used to heal the geranium plants with the cancer. But he wasn't. He was simply the one who reintroduced it. The actual science of oscillation, as far as I can tell, traces back to the late 1800s when Heinrich Hertz, that's where the word Hertz comes from, the measure of frequency, how convenient. He first demonstrated that electromagnetic waves could travel through space. At the time, it was always referred to as the ether. His experiments proved the existence of resonant circuits. Using combinations of wire loops, capacitors, and inductors, these components could receive or emit specific frequencies. Lakovsky, he took this concept and he turned it to biology. As far as I can tell, he's one of the first to do so. He claimed that cells behave like tiny antennas. That underpinned why he did his research with the geraniums in the first place. He wanted to demonstrate his theory, which later became the foundation of his New World Order device, that MWO, Multi-Wave Oscillator. I'll speak on that a bit later. But his original experiments were passive, much like what you and others are doing with Electriculture. So circling back to that antenna principle, which underpins his entire theory, the idea in simple terms is that each cell in the body functions as an antenna. And in the New Age community, this has become quite, commonly understood. It's referred to as DNA being emitter-receiver, and there could be merit to that, because although DNA wasn't discovered in Lakovsky's time, chromosomes and chromatins were. In simple terms, what Lakovsky suggested was that these filaments within cells, that they could conduct small electric charges, and that they contained insulated membranes that were composed of cholesterol and other substances that operated as a dielectric. And much like modern oscillating circuits, within electronics, this biological version, it mimicked that principle with twists and rings and loops and other similarities in the geometric configurations. But the neat thing about his work is that it didn't start with him, and it didn't start with Hertz either. I think there's likely more prehistoric understandings to such matters. I love looking at the past, and in many future segments of the Electriculture Foundation series, we're going to look at ancient technology, ancient megalithic sites. We'll go back into pyramids again with more detail and some strange anomalies that we can, well, better understand and apply within the context of electriculture. Across the world, from Bronze Age Europe to pre-Columbian South America, archaeologists have unearthed peculiar metal objects, very reminiscent of Lakovsky's passive coils. These are open-ended bracelets, often spiraled, much like the work of Slim Sperling and tensor technology. Ancient cultures were making very similar devices with copper, bronze, gold, and silver in very symmetrical forms. It's essentially an oscillating circuit, interestingly enough. They're referred to as torques, Torquus, if you want to search. I'll probably put something in the show notes. So these weren't just jewelry, likely, given what we're going to discover with the work of Lakovsky. They probably had utility as well towards healing and other things of that nature. I even heard stories once about warriors. I can't remember if it was in Rome or elsewhere. It was probably Celtic. That they'd wear them to infuse themselves with more energy and vitality before war, perhaps. I don't think that really compares to all the tensor ring fanatics I see online that put them over their heads and necks and arms. Probably in a year or so I'm going to be doing the same. If you look at sacred architecture like the Well of Santa Cristina in Sardinia, this is really neat. You find another pattern. A precisely engineered semicircular megalithic chamber that was aligned astronomically with the equinox. Amazing. The equinox sun would penetrate right in the center, and also with lunar cycles as well. This was shaped to not just focus light, but potentially even sound, energy, and ceremony. There's this staircase that goes down into the earth. It's like an ancient megalithic well where there's water. So you're getting the telluric energy rising through the earth, moving through the water, seeking to rise up that paramagnetic staircase and unite at the center where the sun at the equinox is penetrating. Amazing. And they would offer their offerings to their gods of fertility, I presume, and they'd place them based on the website. I was looking at the tourist website in Sardinia. They'd place them at the threshold of this staircase. I don't think all of this stuff was random. The more I look into the sheer precision of ancient societies and their designs in association with stellar bodies and cycles and rhythms, and what we know about Lakovsky and now electriculture as a whole, I think there's likely more to it. But really, what led me to that idea in principle is I stumbled across many years ago, I was hearing about vineyards here in Italy that were curing their wine or aging their wine barrels with pyramids over top of them made of copper. They also integrated some with the work of Donnelly spiral antennas and other devices. And even some other people claim to do the same with Lakovsky oscillators, these passive circuits. Everybody said the same thing, that they were getting better wine. It sounded really wild at first, but as I've learned more, and we'll cover it briefly in a moment, there's an association with wine that's really bizarre. I found it in this book from Lakovsky, in which the reference stated that solar cycles, when overlaid with vintage wine years, they mapped up perfectly. So whenever the sun was the most active with charged particles and magnetism, those years resulted in better aged wines. Ultimately, it's electriculture at its finest. It's the vitality of the unseen, right? That cosmic energy from the sun. Lakovsky referred to it in his work as cosmic rays, which is interesting. They're charged particles that they oscillate very fast, a lot of energy within them. And when they hit the Earth, particularly certain geologies, they change their rhythm and they reverberate or oscillate differently as a result. And some geological features or landscapes, such as soils heavy in clay, they amplify cosmic rays more significantly. And this gets into geobiology and the influence of these places increasing rates of cancer and other degenerative diseases, which is really bizarre because what it means is the high amount of energy is oscillating too fast or too significant for our cells to utilize that energy effectively. And the result is the cells replicate faster and eventually mutate and degrade into cancer. Very strange, because this underpins also his technology with the New World Order device and being able to cure cancer. Apparently, I gotta be careful with that word cure, but I digress. Slim Sperling's tensor rings are also amazing. I think I'm gonna have to cover that exclusively in a future segment. I've just been dabbling into it and looking at the way that the rings placed passively around water in a cup when frozen. The water takes on this orb shape that apparently has to do with the center of the rings creating an oscillation, and it shows up in the water. I've seen that even with orgone devices and bubble tech. So I think there's an underpinning connection here, and could probably even link it to Agina's work as we spoke on in season 2, episode 2, I believe. Have a look at that. But ultimately, what this indicates is that Lakovsky thought of our cells as radio receivers. Not literally. He claimed that we were able to pick up frequencies in various bandwidths, and the range was quite significant. He stated, "Thus, I built an oscillator with all the basic wavelengths from 10 centimeters to 400 meters. That is all frequencies from 750,000 to what looks here like 3 billion cycles per second. But each circuit also emits many harmonics, which with their basic waves, their interferences, and their effluvia can reach the scale of infrared and even that of visible light. Since all the cells as well as the chondromes," which as far as I can tell is the term that was used for mitochondria, "oscillate precisely at frequencies in that range, they can therefore find in the output of such an oscillator the frequencies which cause them to vibrate in resonance." I did a search. I had to figure out what that range was. He said that based on that particular wavelength, that was the equivalent of a range of 3 gigahertz to 750 kilohertz, which is about AM radio to even 3G microwaves of modern antennas. So obviously we are bathed in a myriad of different frequencies, naturally, ambient frequencies, not just the Schumann resonance. And some perhaps are better than others, but his theory was that each cell and each tissue has its own range. And when it becomes disharmonic, when it falls out of balance, his view was that by exposing that cell or tissue of cells to its appropriate range, like a radio that's only able to receive a specific frequency, that cell would only receive what it needs within that range. And this is well below ionizing radiation, so it's not damaging the cells theoretically based on current research. I think there is some things that might put this into dispute with, what's that book? I think it's called The Invisible Rainbow by Arthur. I can't remember his name. Sorry. So circling back, that means just like a tuning fork, these circuits that he built, they could pick up on vibrations from the environment or other circuits in the case of the MWO system. And as long as the frequency matched, this is just like how the second tuning fork responds. Only when you strike one, it causes the other one to oscillate. That's the principle. It is like a radio dial. When you think of an old radio with a dial and you turn it, when you turn that dial, you're tuning into a specific frequency. And say a station broadcasting on medium waves, the lower number of oscillations per second, so the speed at which that wave is cresting and arcing in a given second, that medium wave frequency, the internal circuit of the radio is only able to receive or resonate, give a response to that specific bandwidth or frequency. Whereas all other frequencies, whether it's shorter waves or longer waves, they don't have an effect whatsoever on the radio until you turn the dial. And then you're able to receive the signal. So bringing it back to the cells and his theory, when each part of the body has its own natural frequency, that part of the body is only able to tune in to that specific wavelength. So when that cell or the chromosomes or what have you within the cell itself, when they become weakened or damaged, they don't vibrate as they should. So by using external circuits that produce specific frequencies, Lakovsky believed you could restore the healthy vibrations of the cells, like how one tuning fork can make another one start to vibrate. That's the metaphor. So to sum it up, his view was that all radiations in the universe, and he even had a term that he called universion, which encompassed this philosophical view that all things were frequency and vibration, and that when you broke them down to their individual units, you just had energy, and there was this exchange of information happening between all things through oscillations and resonance. It's very distinct in the sense that his view of this disturbance in the ether that travels at the speed of light, it's very reminiscent of last week's episode when we spoke on briefly the Great Pyramids of Giza, speaking on the speed of light. Its numerical value is, I'm just going to read it off. I don't have these numbers in my head. 299792458 meters per second. So that number of the speed of light down to 7 decimals is approximately the exact latitudinal coordinates of the center of the pyramid of Khufu in Egypt, the largest of the 3 pyramids, down to 7 decimal places. It corresponds with the speed of light. Now, archaeologists and physicists would likely say it's completely arbitrary. The metric system really shouldn't have any inherent meaning, and the Egyptians didn't use the metric system, so it's a coincidence. It's a pretty bizarre coincidence, though. The universe might indeed be some kind of simulation of sorts. Because if you were to break those coordinates down, it's so precise with the speed of light that it's literally just offset by about 1 meter 50 centimeters, which when I look at a cross section of the pyramid of Khufu, and I look specifically at the king's chamber relative to the queen's chamber, the deviation between the two would most likely correspond with this 1.5 deviation. So it's as if the exact latitude matching the speed of light happens to be the merger between the divine feminine and the divine masculine at the most marvelous structure in all of human history. It's all very strange. Why did I go on this tangent? I was thinking about the correspondence between light and the work of Lakovsky. I've observed that Lakovsky, when he spoke about his oscillating circuits, he angled them at what many people parrot online as to be 30 degrees. I haven't found in any of his books the original source for that. But what I do find unusual is human DNA, which he knew nothing of at the time. When it is dehydrated, human DNA, the angle of the helix, is exactly 32 degrees. Maybe I'm cherry picking numbers here, but was there a reason why Lakovsky chose this 30 degrees? Maybe it was actually not 30 degrees. Maybe it was 32 degrees, and it was something intuitive of his work. That grand gallery, the width of the grand gallery rising up to the king's chamber, is in Egyptian cubits. Their measurement, it's exactly 2 cubits wide, which a cubit, as far as I can tell, corresponds with the length of the average person's elbow to the tip of the finger when extended outwards. So you could imagine the torso of a person, the navel, with the elbows within the navel angled 90 degrees, and you have the width, the harmonic width of the grand gallery leading to the king's chamber. The king's chamber is where the claimed pharaoh was placed, in which nobody has actually found any evidence to there being a pharaoh. However, that height, the king's chamber, happens to be roughly 1/3 of the way up in the pyramid itself. We'll cover this in future extensions. Perhaps I'll even cover it in a guide. When doing charging with pyramids, you can get greater efficacy when the height of the king's chamber relative to the dimensions of your pyramid, the effects are greater. That is strange. And the weird part also is that the king's chamber is offset slightly north facing. And if you do experiments with pyramids in your garden, you'll notice that on the northern side of your pyramid, the growth is more significant than the south side of the pyramid. It's all very strange. I feel like I'm trying to find some kind of meta pattern or hidden secret by combining the research of many works. And I think eventually I'll crack the code, maybe with your help, with some feedback. When I mentioned the work also of Slim Sperling, he used the cubit measurement of the Egyptians as his measuring gauge with his specific coils. He found the greatest efficacy with using 2 concentric spiraling pieces of copper or other metals like gold. I think he mainly worked with copper, just like Lakovsky, which is interesting. He found the greatest efficacy when combining 2 wires together, angled about 45 degrees, spiraling with each other, and each one of those wires would be measured as 1 cubit, respectively, when combined together, which, strangely enough, corresponds with the Grand Gallery's width. From the center of the Grand Gallery, you have the same measurements that he used. which would correspond with the center of his coil, which he claimed had healing effects and channeled unseen light, which goes back to the work of Gina as well. And it all seems to connect. It's very strange. I haven't really figured it all out, to be honest. I just feel like there's a pattern here that's waiting to be cracked. And if anybody can figure this stuff out, I think it could revolutionize the world in some way. But I digress. Let's go back to Lakovsky. There are many known types of radiations in the universe. Wireless waves, such as radio waves, calorific or heat waves, visible light waves, X-rays and gamma rays on the far end of the spectrum, and even cosmic rays oscillate. These are known gross phenomena of physics that are well understood. One of the key, most important things to understand, though, when it comes to the context of Lakovsky and this work, is that all of those known rays, they oscillate. They have a specific frequency, which is based on the number of times they oscillate per second. It's the wave length. When you imagine a wave that is cresting and arcing, how many of times that wave does that motion in a second will determine its frequency. Therefore, the more times it oscillates, the higher frequency it has, and the shorter the wavelength is. On one end, you would have X-rays as an example, gamma rays as well. But on the other end, the lower frequency, you would have a longer wavelength and that would be radio waves. And that's because the wave itself requires more time in terms of distance being traveled per second in order to crest and arc. And that might not seem like a lot, but when something is traveling at the speed of light, which all of these rays of the electromagnetic spectrum do, which brings us back to the pyramid and its strange coordinates and its ability to channel energy and all that stuff, very unusual. Everything is traveling at that speed. Therefore, one change in its oscillation per second is reflected in potentially vast distances of space. In the case of radio waves, you can go kilometers and kilometers and kilometers between wave crests and arcs. So in order to create a circuit that's able to resonate at that particular frequency or number of oscillations per second, we're pretty limited with small devices. We really can't actually tap into the Schumann resonance as an example, because that extreme low frequency radio waves have such long wavelengths that they simply cannot be harnessed with the technology that we're using in electriculture, which then begs us the question, which is, many people are worried about electriculture antennas picking up on EMF that is, I always want to say EMF frequencies, but that's a misnomer because it's electromagnetic frequencies. Let's just call it EMF waves. Many people are concerned about wavelengths that are deemed unnatural, that are disharmonic because they're not commonly occurring in our atmosphere without the advent of modern technology for communication and the like. Therefore, the argument is that such waves are likely to cause harm to living organisms because we haven't evolved to be exposed to them to a significant degree. There very well may be merit to that. But I also want to acknowledge that it's not just frequencies within 5G and below. It's not just frequencies that we use with modems and cell phones, etc., that range from a few gigahertz all the way up to 5 gigahertz, i.e. 5G, that should make us question the safety of such devices, because even in Lakovsky's time, where radio waves were being used at scale, radio waves have a much lower frequency than what we're presently using with the upper range radio waves moving into microwaves for that range of gigahertz that I mentioned with modems and cell phones, etc. I think for many people this is probably a bit too complicated to follow. I apologize if that's the case. Just take a mental nap and let the right information flow through you and leave the rest behind. I'm going to have to speak on it in terms of a story. I think that's much more enjoyable and less mental masturbation involved. I think what is really important to understand Lakovsky's work, and I'm trying not to go into the weeds because I think this can be very overwhelming for a lot, but I think if you can grasp some of the fundamentals of Lakovsky and his contributions, then you can start to see why some of the passive devices we make with copper and other metals can have a beneficial influence on living things, particularly plants, which aren't as complicated as animal and humans. Plants respond more readily to different subtle changes in frequency. Every living being emits radiation of some kind. We mentioned some of those types of radiation. We're all putting off heat. If you're alive, you're a warm-blooded mammal, you're putting off radiant energy, heat, a lot of infrared radiation. That's ultimately why using infrared saunas tend to be very beneficial, or using far infrared further on the spectrum can be used for healing properties of the mitochondria in our cells. It's well understood that certain radiations are beneficial for life. It's also well understood that many organisms, if not all organisms to some extent, are utilizing various means of interpreting the world around them through subtle vibrational cues that fit within the electromagnetic frequencies that we understand. It's my view that there are also potentially subtle energies that currently are not measured with conventional technology that we are able to pick up with and understand, interpret. This goes into the realm of radiesthesia and dowsing, which, in my view, if you want to integrate passive electriculture techniques at scale, it's worthwhile to eventually study these concepts more deeply. That gets into the whole premise of magnetoreceptivity, the ability of our pineal glands to oscillate in the presence of magnetic fields. This allows us to orient ourselves in space. Potentially, also, the pineal gland allows us to enter into altered states of consciousness. This is associated with astral projection, potentially with remote healing, as well as remote viewing, potentially even the work with map dowsing that I've seen unusual success with. I think this underpins psychic phenomena that connects to our pineal gland. Why am I bringing this up? It's a bit of a tangent, but is it a coincidence that if we oriented ourselves looking towards the south, this is really strange, if we were to look in a southerly direction and consider that the back of our head is facing magnetic north, the pineal gland sits roughly 1/3 of the way up within our brain and slightly offset towards the north. There is the pineal gland offset center. This corresponds with the king's chamber in the pyramid of Giza. It's all very fun to see these connections, but I think there's utility in this. Let me circle back to Lakovsky's view of radiations from living things. So besides magnetoreceptivity in humans and our ability to do various things like find water, think of the Aborigines and their ability to navigate in the hottest, driest, flattest continent on the whole planet and find themselves water when they need it in 40 degrees Celsius desert temperatures. What is that? What is that instinct, if not some kind of psychic phenomena? I think these concepts, we've atrophied this in our modern minds and have locked it away and hidden it in a sarcophagus. Well, I didn't mention earlier too that the strange thing is the Pyramid of Giza is also built at a location on the Earth that if you were to run longitudinally and latitudinally, so on a north-south axis and an east-west axis, there is no other location on the planet where you would find as much terrestrial landmass in either direction. So it has a very significant location relative to our planet's continents. So many strange coincidences. So flying creatures are particularly able to resonate with various frequencies. You've seen this with moths, a moth to a flame, right? But this is also occurring with birds. Migratory birds are using magnetite crystals, likely magnetite crystals in their brain, maybe in their pineal glands, to orient themselves with their environment and understand where they are relative for navigation purposes. And this is well validated with the time of Lakovsky, where carrier pigeons were still commonly used to transport letters and information over vast distances. They could navigate long distances with absolute precision and return when needed to their roost, vast kilometers of distance. But what was unusual that Lakovsky had observed was that carrier pigeons, when exposed to radio towers of the time, broadcasting radio waves, likely military applications initially, when they would get in the presence of these radio towers, they would get confused, disoriented. They would fly in circles as if they've lost their signal, and many times would land. And it wasn't until the radio towers were turned off that immediately the carrier pigeons would begin to reorient themselves in space and begin traveling once more. What this is showing us is that there's something within the pigeons themselves that are allowing themselves to navigate. And it's likely due to Schumann resonant frequencies, so much longer wavelengths relative to the medium range radio waves that were being used in communication towers at that time. So if those radio wave frequencies, I believe in the kilohertz range, is able to cause that amount of disruption, then what happens when we go a billion times stronger into the gigahertz range? I don't know, but I do find it to be a bit disconcerting. So the argument that many people would put forward now is that certain passive electriculture techniques are able to either mitigate harmful EMF ranges, or we could call that harmonize, or some devices are able to amplify ranges. I'm not presently clear on any sound mechanisms for that. It is a very, very good hypothesis given the results that are being seen with living things. So I think if we layer these technologies with the understanding of location in terms of geography, as well as geological features, we can cause different effects. And this goes then also into resonance. If we can create devices that have harmonic geometry, like the pyramids in the last episode, basing them on the Fibonacci sequence, or Phi also in the case of the Great Pyramids. If we can encode harmonic geometries, then we're ultimately going to be creating resonance as a result of electrons oscillating inside these electrically conductive devices that we make. It's going to create very specific wavelengths or frequencies that are likely just as harmonic as the geometry itself, and therefore will have a beneficial influence on life. That is the reasoning behind it, which is why Lakovsky, when he built his coils, he didn't use arbitrary dimensions. His geranium studies with passive coils was done at a diameter of 30 centimeters. He also chose copper wire at larger diameters than what we typically use presently in the community. This is 5 millimeters and up, which is quite expensive. I've ordered some wire of that gauge to start doing some experiments mimicking the original designs of Lakovsky, as opposed to some of the more modern renditions that people are using and claiming to be Lakovsky coils when indeed they're not. This also leads into the work of Slim Sperling, who likely took the resonance principle even further by basing his dimensions on the royal cubit, as I mentioned earlier. It seems arbitrary that Lakovsky would use a diameter of 30 centimeters, but given that he angled his degree at roughly 30 centimeters, then maybe there's something to it that I haven't presently understood, but I don't know exactly. Now, there are likely many of you who are still listening, starting to wonder whether maybe I'm just a crazy dude with a microphone. And I probably am just a crazy dude with a microphone. But I do think Lakovsky had merit to what he's doing. I think even now, a century later, modern science is slowly starting to catch up to some of his ideas. Consider this. If you're thinking that these principles are dubious, consider that NASA has studied electromagnetic stimulation to accelerate wound healing in astronauts. Scientists in Germany have used pulsed electromagnetic fields to promote bone growth and regeneration. And then there are studies on frequency therapies that are suggested that can reduce inflammation, improve circuit, and even influence brainwave phenomena. So the idea that resonant frequencies influence biology is not fringe. What is fringe, however, is that we can do so with passive techniques that don't have any direct electrical current running through it, at least high voltage current. We get some current just due to passive phenomena, and if we layer metals in a specific way, we can create greater amounts of current. We spoke about that with the work of Christoph Floh and his, I didn't mention it, but he also has patents with coils, very reminiscent of Slim Sperling, only much, much older, of course. And in his design, it looks like he's mixing copper with zinc and iron, which would create an electrical current through conventional means of dissimilar metals that generates current as a result of a thermoelectric gradient, so heat gradient differential, as well as a galvanic reaction, which is just one metal robbing electrons from another. And in doing so, electrons move, and that generates electrical current. The coil of Lakovsky, however, is generating current likely due to its magnetic orientation, causing the magnetic field within the presence of the coil to move electrons in the coil as they oscillate from side to side, with the north portion being left open. That means that the electrons are jumping from side to side, and depending upon the geometry of the coil, they're creating, as they move, a specific frequency of resonance. I don't know if this is making a lot of sense. I'm sorry, but we have to cover these concepts to some degree if you want to understand electroculture much more deeply and give merit to what many of us are doing. I think we need to grasp these concepts. If you're new to this podcast and you're wondering, well, what is electroculture? Electroculture is the harnessing of energy. Usually it's magnetic and electric, so electromagnetism, in order to stimulate life, and that is typically applied to plants. I do believe, in my view, that electroculture needs to integrate energies that we presently don't understand, that don't fit within electromagnetism and conventional physics, and this gives merit to some of the more unusual techniques, such as shape, geometry, and subtle energy frequencies. So Georges Lakhovsky, he didn't just use copper, he experimented with various metals. He used aluminum, iron, tin, and silver. Those are the ones that I have come across in my research. I've heard some people claim that he used combinations or alloys of metal, as well as combinations of metals integrated together. I haven't found anything that has proven that statement, so I'm presently not convinced. I think there are a lot of people in the electroculture community, by and large, who are seeking fame or influence or money, who are making claims that aren't actually based on any evidence. And there are probably some things that I say that aren't really based on evidence, but I'm trying to do my best to research as deep as possible and be as honest and integral as I can. I just want to say that it's important to, when you listen to anybody, including myself, don't take everything that I'm saying as absolute truth. Question. Do your own homework. If you like the work I'm doing, if you appreciate the content I'm creating and the research that I'm doing, then by all means, listen to me. Trust me if you must. But just know that I'm human and not going to get things perfect. So based on these different metals and his experiments, this led him to an understanding that all materials are able to oscillate at different frequencies, and therefore certain metals may have benefit, whereas others may not. And an example that I heard from the work of Yannick von Dorn, who is a French pioneer in electroculture, and I haven't found the original source for this, but I will quote Yannick. He said that lead was used by Lakovsky, and he observed with the use of lead in his passive coils a stunting effect on plants, which is strange because plants, when poisoned with lead in the soil, they become stunted and smaller. Lead is very heavy, so maybe there's a connection between lighter metals and elongation of plants, and heavier metals and a shortening of plants, perhaps changing the way plants respond to gravity. To me, that has some logical merit. The breakthrough was as elegant as it was radical. A passive coil, properly tuned, could restore a sick organism's natural oscillation without any external power source. The implications sent a shiver down his spine. His geraniums had not been a fluke. The coils were not just conducting energy, they were amplifying life's natural resonance. And if that was true, then the applications stretched far beyond plants. Lakovsky's breath was slow and measured as he stepped back, staring at his thriving specimens. His mind was already leaping forward toward a future where sickness was not battled with knives and chemicals, but tuned away like a musician adjusting the strings of an instrument. The body was not a machine, it was an orchestra, and for the first time, like so many great mystics of the ages, he had glimpsed the hidden music of life. When Lakovsky realized these concepts, I think that's when he coined the title of what later became his book, The Secret of Life. Likely, this was a secret, and for many it remains as such. You are few who are listening to these theories and seeing for yourself effects on plants. And if you haven't, well, in time I'll teach you how to apply this correctly. Lakovsky's coils were just the beginning. By 1930, his experiments had moved beyond plants. His early successes had opened a door he could no longer ignore. If a simple copper coil could fortify a living organism against disease, what might be possible with something more refined? He began working on a device unlike anything seen before, a machine not to fight disease, but to restore the body's lost resonance, a system that could bathe a patient in a symphony of electromagnetic frequencies, allowing each cell to tune itself to the frequencies it needed for repair and regeneration. Thus, the Multi-Wave Oscillator, MWO, was born. It was a marvel of engineering. The device emitted a broad spectrum of electromagnetic waves, allowing cells to selectively absorb the frequencies they required to restore their vitality. Unlike pharmaceutical treatments, which imposed external chemicals onto the body, the MWO worked in harmony with the body's natural rhythms, and the results were staggering. Hospitals across France, Italy, and Switzerland began using Lakovsky's machines in patient treatments. Reports poured in of chronic illnesses reversing, infections clearing, and degenerative conditions improving, all after exposure to the multi-wave oscillator. In Paris, doctors reported cases of patients with advanced infections recovering rapidly after just a few sessions. In Italy, Lakovsky's MWO was used in hospitals to assist with arthritis, skin disorders, and neurological conditions. Even in Switzerland, where medicine was steeped in rigid traditions, doctors quietly integrated the machine into their practices, astounded by the results. By the mid-1930s, thousands of MWOs had been distributed worldwide. Patients who had exhausted all conventional treatments found hope in the flickering, humming energy of Lakovsky's machine. Lakovsky's MWO machine, this was really taking his work of passive coils and applying high voltage electricity to generate specific frequency ranges. And the patient would sit in the middle, not being electrocuted, but being exposed to the resonance. This approach is very similar to his passive coils. Unlike the passive coils, the MWO had a greater range of frequencies. Lakovsky's view was that plants are less complicated as humans and animals, and therefore using simple devices will likely work well on plants. But human cells have a varying range of frequencies, and therefore external application of electrical current and generation of resonance needed to be used. Lakovsky was not a lone voice. Across Europe, other researchers had begun recognizing the same patterns, some inspired by his work, others arriving at similar conclusions independently. Before the Second World War, a quiet but growing movement of scientists was uncovering the hidden relationship between electromagnetism and life. Together they formed a clandestine network of minds, pushing the boundaries of physics, chemistry, and biology. In 1931, a French scientist named it.To compiled years of experiments into a book titled Cellular Oscillation. This was no mere speculation. His research detailed dozens of studies conducted across France and other countries, including hundreds of trials on plants, animals, and even human subjects, all pointing toward the same conclusion. Cells were not passive biological units. They were electromagnetic resonators. It.To.'s findings carried profound implications. If individual cells and tissues resonated at specific frequencies essential for health and vitality, then disease was not merely a biochemical disorder, but a disruption of these natural oscillations. More importantly, restoring those oscillations could promote health and healing. His research built upon Lakovsky's work, offering validation from multiple laboratories. The data was meticulous, revealing a pattern too consistent to ignore. When an organism's natural frequencies were disrupted or disturbed, disease took hold. But when those frequencies were restored, healing could begin. And he was not alone. By 1933, another major breakthrough had emerged, this time from Portugal. Antonio de Pereira Forres, the director for life at the Lisbon Science Academy, took things even further. A physicist and chemist, Forres examined Lakovsky's theories on spatial energy and universal resonance in his book titled Matter. But unlike many theorists, Forres didn't stop at hypotheses. He put them to the test. By the way, I'm reading from my book. What he discovered was remarkable. Oscillating circuits, devices generating specific electromagnetic frequencies, could alter chemical processes. Under their influence, ethyl alcohol and formic acetic acid underwent entirely new reactions that defied conventional chemistry. He called this phenomena the new ondulatory chemical mechanism. Among its implications, the ability to accelerate wine aging, reduce acidity in oils, and even influence fermentation, all by applying electromagnetic waves. Imagine aging a fine bottle of wine in minutes rather than years, simply by exposing it to the right frequencies. It sounded like science fiction, but Forres had demonstrated it in 1933. Now consider what that could mean for plant growth, soil health, and even human biology. If electromagnetism could refine the chemistry of oils, what else could it balance, harmonize, or enhance within living organisms? His findings did not go unnoticed. They were submitted to the Paris Academy of Sciences, London's Royal Society, Berlin's Chemical Society, and Portugal's Academy of Sciences on July 20th, 1933, a sign that Lakovsky's work was no longer confined to the fringes. The world was starting to listen, but history had other plans. It's been 2 years now, 2 long years, the Electriculture Beginners to Advanced community about to reach a milestone. We're going to hit 300,000 members before the summer of 2025 is finished. But it's a lot of hard work, oh my goodness. I have over 100 pieces of written content on our Substack. If you haven't seen that, take a look. A lot of effort, a lot of love, all available for free. And the Foundation series, this podcast itself, presently 2 to 3 days of work every single week. I am starting to burn myself thin. But I'm in this for the long haul. I'm rooted in passion. I want to see Electriculture spread the world over. What this movement can do is incredible. And what it means, most importantly, for people like you, is an opportunity to not just grow high-quality, nutrient-dense food with less, but to do so in a way that radically transforms not just the way you grow food, but the way you see yourself and the very cosmos that you're a part of. I think within this movement lies a hidden gem, a newfound paradigm of life. And if you're in this like me, slowly it's going to be revealed. I promise you. But in order to make this happen, in order to keep going on this project as it is, I need to ask a favor. Although we've reached our first $1,000 worth of committed members to the Foundation Insider Editions, it's not enough for me to keep going. Yet, here I am. I need to 10x this project. And here's what I'm asking of you. Go into the show notes, click a link that says ratethispodcast.com/electro. And there you'll be prompted to leave a review. This will help more people interested in Electriculture to discover the show and hopefully learn some valuable information and help the movement grow. By 1939, the scientific community had begun testing these principles on a grander scale. A report from the Chemical Engineer Corps detailed an ambitious study involving 120 different plant species. The premise was simple: expose plants to oscillatory circuits and measure the results. The outcome, however, was anything but ordinary. Across the board, plants exposed to electromagnetic resonance exhibited the following: faster growth rates, increased disease resistance, greater resilience to environmental stressors. The evidence was no longer theoretical. It was practical, repeatable, and measurable. This is back in the 1930s. We're still arguing about it now. For us, work, along with the plant studies that followed, mirrored something eerily familiar decades later. Modern farmers would begin rediscovering these same principles under the name Electriculture, the practice of using atmospheric and electromagnetic forces to enhance life, mainly plant vitality. But this raised a troubling question. If this knowledge had existed nearly a century ago, why had it been forgotten? The answer remained elusive, but speculation painted a sobering picture. Lakovsky, Forhus, Duin, these were not fringe theorists. They were credentialed scientists, their research published and reviewed by the highest academic institutions of their time. Their work was recognized, their discoveries documented, and yet, as history marched forward, their breakthroughs seemed to vanish into obscurity. Forhus experiments, along with the plant studies that followed, bore an uncanny resemblance to what today's electriculture practitioners were rediscovering. Farmers experimenting with copper coils, Lakovsky antennas, and the use of magneticulture had begun reporting the same effects: faster plant growth, increased yields, and greater resistance to pests. Could it be that these early pioneers had already unlocked the key to energy-based agriculture nearly a century ago? If their findings had not been buried by time, or perhaps something more deliberate, how much further might we be in understanding the role of electromagnetism in life? And more importantly, who stood to lose if this knowledge ever became more common practice? It should have been a golden age of medicine and agriculture. Instead, as we will discover later, the world was darkening. As Lakovsky's work reached its peak, the storm clouds of war gathered over Europe. In Germany, 1933, Adolf Hitler rose to power. In Italy, Mussolini tightened his grip. In Spain, Franco prepared for war. Across the continent, the machinery of fascism stirred to life, consuming everything in its path. And Lakovsky knew science was never safe in times of war. By 1939, Nazi forces had begun sweeping across Europe. Laboratories were ransacked, research was seized, and scientists were forced to make a choice: collaborate, flee, or disappear. The rise of fascism brought a chilling shift in the scientific world. Medical advancements were no longer pursued for the sake of healing. They became tools of power. Experiments once dedicated to understanding life were twisted into instruments of control. Lakovsky understood what was coming. His work was too valuable, his ideas too disruptive. If the wrong hands seized his research, it could be perverted into something monstrous. And so he fled. I'm getting goosebumps reading this passage from my book. I'm starting to kind of grasp what he must have been feeling, because in many ways I'm feeling something similar, but I won't go there quite yet. In 1940, Georges Lakhovsky left France for the United States, carrying with him only what he could. He arrived in a country that claimed to champion scientific progress, but here a different kind of enemy awaited him. I live in Europe, Italy. I see the impact that war is having on this continent. It's not the same as World War II, of course, but people are devastated. There really isn't a lot of opportunity for alternative research such as this. It's difficult to get funded. it's difficult to sustain oneself. And I'm experiencing that firsthand with trying this movement out. And I feel though we're at a critical junction. We're at a moment now where collectively we have the ability to move this forward. In the past, individually, the flame would get snuffed out. But as a whole, I think if we get enough momentum, we can start to reawaken what's possible here in the benefit of life. This is my hope. Maybe I'm naive, but I do feel like I'm seeing a swell that it's difficult to suppress. When our community on Facebook was growing from 10,000 to 100,000 and beyond, during COVID, we started to get censored, and I saw it. The throttle was basically put out. It was 6 months where we just plateaued and there was no growth whatsoever. The metrics tumbled. The reach of people's posts went down. I get to see under the hood, so I could see the analytics. Facebook was doing something strange. Now, with Trump, and I'm not going to go into politics, but with Trump in the United States, Mark Zuckerberg, I think out of fear of their company being broken up or sued, they've reduced what they claim to be fact-checking. And since then, our community has exploded once more. But something strange has started happening. I haven't told anybody this, but as an admin of our Facebook community, I have been completely unengaged. Not by choice. Whenever I use my sign-in account, my computer freezes up. I can't go onto Facebook. It doesn't work. I've tried different browsers. I've toggled cookies. I've made attempts to reduce this problem, but the friction is huge. Now, I don't want to be conspiratorial, but even David and his wife, who are both admins of the community, have their own challenges. They're not able to tag people, and sometimes certain things are restricted from being shared. I'm frustrated by this. It means that the work we've put into building the community on a selfish level, I was hoping that we could utilize that leverage to help grow the education side of things, which I'm doing presently with the podcast here. But I haven't been able to share it. I can't. And when I do, Facebook reduces the reach. We don't get any exposure. It's not even worth my time. So I'm at a loss, honestly. If you've stayed with me this long on this episode, I want to thank you. Something different is going to happen. I'm not going to go into a classical extension as I've done in past episodes. It's just getting too difficult. And I did a poll with many of you on our email newsletter, and I quickly realized that most of you, 80%, are interested in more guides. You want practical information. You want less of this heady monologues and audio-based extensions. That's kind of what I gleaned. So that's what I'm going to do. Now, before I close down here and start working behind the scenes on some practical guide material, carrying on the work of last week's pyramid episode and going into some of the finer details, I need to make another request. And this is the truth. This podcast needs more exposure. Because I am completely kiboshed and I can't do anything in the community, I need you to take an incentive. If you are an active member of the Electriculture Beginners to Advanced community, please share this podcast. Share anything of value that you have received within our newsletter. Share that with the community. Try tagging me so that I can see whether the metrics are working and what the results are, because we need a new strategy. I can't do it. I can't. And the reach, as I told you earlier after the ad before, for this podcast is next to nothing. And it's a bit troubling. So please help this movement grow. We need more practical information, but we also need more foundational research. We need the synthesis of the pioneers, which is what I'm trying to do with this series, and I hope you are getting value out of that. It needs to be a collective effort, and if you are really inspired by Electriculture and what you're seeing in the community, maybe you need to spread this information word of mouth. I think we do, honestly. I think technology is, well, it's not moving in the right direction, in my view. I have a lot of worries about AI, and I've noticed with my research that AI is becoming, at least with ChatGPT and other sources, it's becoming very, very biased. It is restricting the ability to get accurate information on this stuff. And sometimes I have to input my own data into my own third-party systems that other people don't have access to. I'm doing that because, well, there's a few reasons. One is the AI system is actually restricting accurate information, and I don't know why. Also, I'm finding that I'm doing a lot of hard work with research, and I'm finding that there are other people, I don't want to call them competitors, but there are other individuals taking up in the English community Electriculture who are, they're literally just piggybacking off my work. And I've noticed with a few email newsletters that some individuals are actually just repeating segments of the Foundation series, some of the best parts that they're extracting with AI. And that's frustrating because I'm putting a lot of time into this. I'll stop complaining, I'll stop ranting, but please support the movement. And I'll finish with the final chapter passage from my book on Georges Lakhovsky. I think we can glean a lot from this in the present times. By the early 20th century, Western medicine was no longer a frontier of open discovery. It had become an industry, a machine of its own, powered by pharmaceuticals, patents, and profit. The idea that healing could happen without drugs, without surgery, without a product to sell, was not just radical, it was dangerous. Lakovsky found himself facing a different kind of suppression, not from war, but from busyness. The pharmaceutical industry, growing in power, saw his work as a threat. If disease could be treated with electromagnetic resonance, what would happen to the billion-dollar industry built around pills and procedures? Suddenly, the doors that were once open to him began to close. Hospitals that had once embraced his technology were pressured to abandon. Medical journals refused to publish his findings. Doctors using the MWO quietly stopped, some out of fear, others under pressure from regulatory bodies. His life's work was slipping through his fingers. And then, in 1942, came the final blow. Lakovsky was struck by a car in New York City. He was hospitalized, but denied the very technology he invented. He died shortly after. No autopsy, no investigation, just silence. His research, once celebrated, was buried. His machines, once in hospitals across Europe, disappeared. His books, once wildly read, faded into obscurity. And with his death, an entire field of scientific inquiry was strangled before it could reach its potential. I still have goosebumps. I don't even get angry about this stuff anymore. I used to have so much anger to the repression of technologies and techniques that can be of benefit to humanity and the planet that don't get exposure, that get kiboshed and quelled. Now I don't know if it's stages of grief, but now it just makes me a bit sad, to be honest. But I can't go there. I won't go there. I refuse. Because we can't let this crush our spirit. I resisted COVID. Our business collapsed. I stayed true to my moral compass at great expense to my family. And I'll continue to do so as best I can. And I hope you do the same. So, blessings here from Italy. If I don't see more numbers coming through as registrants for the extensions to the Foundation series, if that doesn't happen on this episode, as it has started to decrease in numbers, I am going to pivot, and in doing so, I may not come out with the same Electriculture Foundation series episode next week. I may reduce the numbers to doing it every second week, and I will be putting more of my energy into all of you who have committed to the extensions. I will start making guides and putting my energy into that, because you're the ones who are ready to join me in the practical side of things. So thank you very much, and hopefully I'll see all of you next week.